Over the last 2 weekends, I've attended 2 different Colorado cubing competitions, I've competed in 16 different rounds, and completed a total of 80 official solves. So as always, I want to tell you about my best solves, walking through each round one at a time and telling you how I did. This first competition was an afternoon-only competition. There were 2 halves, you could only sign up for one. It was called Pikes Peak Good Afternoon 2022. So first up was the first round of Skewb. Now part of the reason I came to this competition was because they had 2 rounds of Skewb, and I really wanted to break that PR average of 5.84 that I've held now since 2019. And as you can see, I did get 3 pretty good solves, but I also got 2 slower ones, and of course you need at least 4 good solves to get a good average, so I ended up with a pretty mediocre 6.26. I believe that 8-second solve in particular, I had a 3-second pause, but luckily, despite some slow recognition, I would still have a lot of opportunities to break this average over the coming week. 3x3 round 1 was an eventful one because I set a new PR single and I almost set a new PR average. As you can see, my average was 14.03, just 0.01 off of my PR of 14.02, but this 10-second solve was really nice. I talked about it in my most recent video. It was an X-cross, somewhat intentionally, but the rest of the solve was totally full step, just nice and smooth, great execution, great look ahead, although it would be quickly overshadowed in the second round of 3x3. One-handed is a weird event because I have a lot of potential in it. I pretty consistently average around 26 or 27 seconds, so long as I get good last layer cases. But the problem is, there's a solid maybe 1/3 of OLLs and PLLs that I just can't execute with one hand. It's total muscle memory doing it with 2 hands, but it just doesn't translate over. So I really need to start practicing my Alex with one hand, and that'll make it so I can start getting some decent one-handed averages instead of all these mediocre 29s. Clock is a weird event that I was strangely looking forward to because this was my first time officially competing with the Chi clock, which came out in 2020. If you don't know, the Chi clock is so much better than the Rubiks clock, which everyone used to use. Without doing any practice, it dropped a couple seconds off my average, but unfortunately, after submitting my puzzle, I had to wait like 10 minutes before doing my first solve, and I didn't have a practice clock on me, so my first couple solves were pretty rusty. I got a DNF there, which is pretty common in clock. I did eventually get warmed up again on those last few solves, and even messing up so badly, I still got a PR average, but on a better day, I think I could probably average maybe 11 or 12. Then in the final round of Skewb, I actually did pretty well with a 6 flat average, very close to breaking that PR there. I had a lot of decent solves, a very consistent average overall for Skewb, but those couple of solves closer to 7 seconds were enough to drag that average right out of PR range. But luckily, as consolation prize, this was the final round of Skewb, and this average was good enough to get me 2nd place at the competition. Then the 6th and final round of this half-day competition was 3x3 finals. This is one of the rare cases where I actually made it into every single round that they held, and I'm glad that I did because during this round, I got the craziest official solve, perhaps the craziest solve of my life. It was so crazy that last week I made an entire video about it that you should definitely go watch, but basically the scramble was so insane that even though my execution was pretty bad, it still managed to set an overall PB during a competition. My fastest 3x3 solve ever while competing. But needless to say, starting off the average with 2 great solves, plus being constantly distracted about whether I was going to podium in Skewb, meant that my final 3 solves were pretty poor, 16, 16, 16, so no PR average for me. Now the next competition, the next weekend, was Cubing in Craig 2022. Now Craig is a small town in northwestern Colorado that's about 4 hours from the majority of the population, so a lot of people had pretty long drives, including myself. I had to wake up at 4 a.m. to get there. Now luckily, it was a full day competition with not a lot of people, which meant there was time for a lot of events, and they actually ran so ahead of schedule, they ended up adding more rounds of almost every event. For a total of 15 rounds, I got to compete in 10 of them. The first round of the day was 2x2. I think I've expressed my thoughts about this event enough. I cannot get myself to care about it any more than I already do, which is not a lot. I average around 4 seconds usually. I guess I wasn't really warmed up yet, so I ended up with a 5, an 8, a 5, and a 5 for an average of 5 of 5. In 3x3, I started off with 3 pretty decent solves, but as the story usually goes, some combination of nerves and bad luck meant that those last 2 solves weren't so great. Luckily, there was an extremely generous cutoff to make it into the second round. I think some people averaging 30 seconds made it in, which is pretty crazy, never seen that before, but let's just say that that PR average continued to elude me. In Pyraminx, I invoked the expert strategy of not doing a single practice solve until you're up there to compete, which, as you can see, didn't turn out too well for me. Funny story though, on the 3rd scramble, I got a pretty good time, and I could have sworn it was the exact same scramble as the first solve, and so I went and talked to the delegate. He re-scrambled it for me with the correct 3rd scramble. I got the cube once again, and it was the exact same scramble for a 3rd time. So I've looked back at the footage, and indeed, I did somehow get the 3rd scramble on my first solve. I'm not exactly sure how you mix that up, but eventually the delegate gave me an extra scramble instead, and so that 3rd solve ended up being a much worse scramble. In the first round of Skewb, every single solve for me ended up having a massive 1 to 3 second pause. That's really my biggest weakness at this point using Sarah's advanced method, is that I'm just not very good at recognizing some of the cases. That'll of course improve with practice. The important part though is that it got me to the second round of Skewb, which again they added on the fly. If you're wondering, that 10-second solve there, I got probably the worst Skewb case imaginable, a Z-perm plus 2 twisted corners. Man, 4x4 was probably the most tragic event of the day for me. me. I haven't really been practicing it a lot, but I was just feeling really fast, look good, was really smooth, and I was getting lucky cases. I started off with a bunch of really good times, apart from that 110 where I totally messed up. That would obviously be my worst solve, and basically all I needed was a sub 1 minute solve to get a PR average. But under a lot of pressure, I managed to mess up first 2 centers somehow, the easiest part, and the rest of the solve wasn't great either. A lot of little pauses during edge pairing and 3x3 stage. I was just so nervous that the look ahead kind of fell apart. If that had been, say, a 53, which it easily could have been, I would have destroyed my PR average, but I guess not this time around. I'm not exactly sure what happened in the second round of 3x3. I feel like I was solving pretty well. I guess I just got a lot of bad cases or something. Funny thing though about that 19-second solve, there was a really obvious F2L pair during inspection that I tried to preserve to make an X cross, but ended up being in the worst possible spot, so much so that I eventually ended up just giving up on it and making the cross anyway, and so I started my first F2L pair at about 7 seconds. The chaos of this round of square one started about 10 minutes beforehand when I was frantically trying to figure out how to do one of the U-perms that I had totally forgotten. I had to look up the algorithm, and then I don't think I relearned how to tell the two U-perms apart until somewhere around the third solve. It's a miracle that I didn't mess them up at some point, but somehow, despite all of that, I still managed to start off the average with 2 very decent solves. But that's about all I can say because the average went downhill very quickly from there. On that last solve in particular, I actually messed up the parity algorithm because my middle layer was aligned weirdly, and with the time fast approaching a minute, I realized it wasn't going to affect my average anyway, and so I decided to just DNF because I was holding up the whole competition at that point. One-handed was pretty much the same story as last competition. The solves were pretty mediocre in the first place, but just to put the nail in the coffin, I managed to get an N-perm, which I had to do 2-look, followed by a G-perm, also 2-look, followed by a V-perm, which I just managed to get out very slowly, followed by an F-perm, which I also managed, also slowly, followed by my best solve of the average, a J-perm. But because this average was so bad and I didn't make it to finals, whereas most of the staff members did, I ended up with quite the unique experience of single-handedly, no pun intended, scrambling the entire final round of one-handed, which was kind of stressful when the cubes start piling up and knowing that you're the bottleneck for a dozen people competing, but honestly, kind of fun. In the final round of Pyraminx, I somehow managed to do not too bad with an average just 1 second off my PR, which was set way back in 2017 with a different method. I also managed to get this 3-second single, really easy scramble. You could basically see the whole thing right off the bat. And even more so than Skewb, I really need to practice Pyraminx a lot just to improve recognition for L4E and eliminate some of those pauses. Right now I'm basically just doing it intuitively, which is really slow. I think by just refining that last step, I could easily start averaging more like 4 or 5 seconds. And it's time for the grand finale, my 16th round of official competing in half as many days, and it did not disappoint. The average actually started out really badly for me. I had pretty much all but given up hope after that second solve because I knew it was counting, but then miraculously I got 2 really good solves, and then I managed to hold it together for that final 5-second solve for a PR average of 5.27, and I didn't really realize at the time, but also a PR single of 3.49. I actually set both those previous PRs at the same competition back in 2019, so it's really nice that learning Surah's Advanced has finally started to pay off. So yeah, I'm super happy to come away from these couple weekends with those 2 PRs as well as that insane 3x3 single, and I guess the clock average too. And if you watched this far, you clearly like competition videos, so good news, there's another 1 or probably 2 competitions coming up in Colorado in the next month or so, plus North American Championships 2022, very big exciting competition in Toronto this summer. I was supposed to be there in 2020, but of course it got canceled, so you should expect me to be there this year. But yeah, for the time being, I hope you all enjoyed this double competition video, and that's pretty much it. I'll see you guys next time.